Assignment Discovery now presents Free at Last, Part 1.
In the darkest days of the civil rights era, militant racists sought to destroy the movement. Their tactic was terror. It was a time of reckoning for America. By most accounts, it was a war. The stakes were nothing less than freedom.
The civil rights movement was really a struggle to ensure that America would live up to its promises of equality written in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence.
On one side stood those who sought to abolish a centuries-old system of state-sanctioned segregation.
These people literally put their bodies on the line to make our country something better. Many of these young people went into the lion's den. It was very dangerous.
Every time the blood of the innocent was spilled, every time a worker was martyred, it exploded interest in our struggle.
The beating and killing of our clergymen and young people will not divert us. We're on the move now. Yes, sir.
On April 4th, 1968, a shot rang out in the Memphis night. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the civil rights movement, was assassinated as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. A life of flesh and blood that had taken on mythic proportions had come to an end. But while King was the epicenter and conscience of the movement, there were other martyrs to its cause. Men and women who died in defiance, children who died in innocence. This is their story. An August Mississippi night in 1955. An old shack juts out of a cotton field like a blister. 14-year-old Emmett Till is in bed, restless from the heat and humidity. A truck drives up a dusty road. Two white men get out and enter the house. Inside, the owner of the shack, Emmett's granduncle, 64-year-old Mose Wright, protests. But the two men roust the boy out of bed and force him into their truck. Emmett Till is on a journey from which he will never return. Till had come out a week earlier from Chicago, but he'd lived a quiet life with his mother Mamie. Though some accounts characterize the boy as a prankster, a risk-taker, his mother disagrees.
He was a good boy, and when he wasn't looking after me and the things around the house, we had about 3 or 4 older people in the neighborhood that he saw to religiously.
Till left Chicago in August of 1955 to spend the summer with his favorite cousins in Money, Mississippi. Population, 55. He'd been warned by his mother that things were different in the South.
I told him to be sure to say yes, sir, and no, sir. That was one of the first things I told him. And then I told him, I said, if you meet a white woman, you do not look at her. You drop your head. I said, if necessary, you step off the sidewalk and let her pass.
His mother's warning was prophetic, for it was an encounter with a white woman in a general store one afternoon that would prove fatal to Emmett Till. By some accounts, Emmett had walked out of the store and said bye, baby, to Carolyn Bryant, the shopkeeper. From a modern perspective, the incident may seem like nothing. But in the context of that time in the South, it was a potent incident that touched on racial and sexual taboos. Whatever Emmett Till's momentary indiscretion was, he might as well have lit a bonfire. Ever since the end of the Civil War, despite gaining their freedom from slavery, blacks had been decreed second-class citizens in the South. Segregation wasn't just a way of life, it was the law of the land. The so-called Jim Crow laws created a state-sanctioned racial caste system.
Jim Crow laws is the name that came to apply to those laws, which was passed after Reconstruction when whites began to take back political power in the South. And they passed laws that forbid a black person, for example, to go to white schools, to ride on the bus without sitting in the back. Any number of laws that basically codified or made illegal for black people to exercise rights that white people had.
But in 1954, 1 year before the Till incident, the Supreme Court, in the historic Brown versus Topeka Board of Education ruling, made it illegal for school systems to segregate blacks. It set the South simmering. The South sought to cling to the traditions it had held in its glory days. Any change to that way of life made many Southern whites angry. No black would be allowed to cross the color line. So when the townspeople of Money, Mississippi perceived that Emmett Till had crossed that line at the expense of the dignity of a white woman, it sealed his fate. After being abducted from his uncle's home, Till was taken by Carolyn Bryant's husband, Roy, and his brother-in-law, J.W. Millam, to a remote shack. Emmett Till died a horrible death. To the Southern establishment that lorded over its black citizens, Till's death at first had no impact. But Emmett Till's death would not go down as just another lynching.
People didn't forget it. It had just a galvanizing effect, particularly on the black population.
Dr. King would often say, honor and suffering is redemptive, and there's power in innocent blood. The innocent blood of Emmett Till exploded and hit the national consciousness in ways that was irreversible.
In 1955, the death of Emmett Till was just one more reason for Medgar Evers to continue his work as a civil rights activist. He was the NAACP's first field representative in Mississippi. Having grown up in the Jim Crow South, Medgar was a man on a mission.
There were any number of things in his childhood that really made him acutely aware of the injustices. As a young man who volunteered to go into the army to fight for his country in World War II, and then come home and find that he was still a second-class citizen, not being able to register and vote, he said, this has to change. And he decided that he would be a part of that change.
Evers fought for change in the racially charged climate of Mississippi.
Mississippi was considered the South Africa of America. It was like the most oppressive state, the most anger and fear and hatred and violence. And so his courage in the context of that state took on bigger than life meaning.
Medgar Evers, like so many black people whose families before them were raised in the South, actually loved the South. And they had this tremendous hope that things would change.
But as Medgar worked on the front lines of change, he placed his life in jeopardy.
Just working for civil rights in Mississippi, it was a strike against you. You're a marked person. He knew that.
Medgar and his family lived with death threats. It was a life of barricaded doors and ever-drawn window blinds and safety drills for the children. Despite the dangers, in early 1963, Evers began an active campaign to force the issue of racial inequality in Jackson, Mississippi. He organized demonstrations, went head-to-head with the mayor and the city's business leaders.
We were determined under Medgar's leadership to forge ahead, to crack the system. And they were determined to wipe him out because he was the leader.
On May 28, 1963, the NAACP began sit-ins at Woolworth's, where blacks were not served at the lunch counter. That night, someone threw a Molotov cocktail at Evers' home. Damage was minimal, but the message was clear. Prophetically, at an NAACP gathering in Jackson on June 7th, Evers told the crowd, "I love my children and I love my wife, and I would die and die gladly if that would make a better life for them." On the night of June 12th, here in what was then the NAACP office, Evers watched with other movement leaders as President John F. Kennedy delivered an impassioned speech on civil rights.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. We have a right to expect that the Negro community will be responsible, will uphold the law, but they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution will be colorblind.
Medgar was thrilled with the speech and then met with his NAACP colleagues late into the evening. When their meeting was over, he drove home. In a nearby vacant wooded lot, a sniper crouched behind some honeysuckle. Medgar's car turned into his driveway. As Medgar stepped out of his car, Medgar and Murley's worst fears had come true. His death was not considered a lynching, but an assassination.
It was a real sign of changes to come that his body came all the way to Washington and his widow and little children went to the White House and that he was buried in Arlington Cemetery and accepted as somebody, as a martyr.
He must be looked upon as one who helped liberate and free the state of Mississippi, the South, and the nation. You know, he had many opportunities to leave, to do something else, but he decided to stay. And he paid a heavy price. He gave his life.
Medgar Evers' death served as a rallying cry for the movement. 2 months later, on August 28, 1963, a crowd of 250,000 gathered for a historic march in Washington. It was the largest demonstration for human rights that America had ever seen. Black and white, Jew, Protestant, and Catholic had come together with the hope that equality, liberty, and justice would prevail for everyone. In 1964, as summer drew near, people in the civil rights movement dubbed it Freedom Summer and laid out an ambitious agenda. College students up north were being recruited to travel to the South and work for the movement. The main destination was Mississippi, where only a tiny fraction of all blacks were registered to vote. The primary goal was to sign them up. The secondary goal was to avoid getting killed.
The Klan in Mississippi were so deep-seated in violence and intimidation and harassment of blacks to keep them from voting that they would do anything possible to continue the way of life. And when they found out that they could not, they did have to resort to murder.
They saw us as outsiders. They saw us as troublemakers. They saw us as agitators.
The movement was looking for new volunteers. When a civil rights recruiter came to New York City's Queens College in June 1964, the purpose of the mission he described struck a chord in Andrew Goodman, age 20. Andy had been raised in a Jewish home where ethics and social activism held great importance.
Andy heard what was happening down there and how black people were not able to vote, and he came home and he told me about it. And he said that he wants more than anything else to go down there.
Andy joined other recruits in Oxford, Ohio, where they were trained on how to help register black voters and what to expect from the South segregationists. James Foreman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee warned the students, "I may be killed. You may be killed." Andy would soon meet up with Michael Schwerner, another activist from a similar background. Schwerner was a college-educated Jewish man from New York. 6 months earlier, Mickey and his wife Rita had come to Meridian, Mississippi. In 1964, this building housed the local chapter of CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality. Rita and Mickey began working here with CORE worker James Chaney. He was a passionate young man who'd grown up under the sting of segregation and racism and felt compelled to act on his beliefs.
James Chaney lived in Meridian. He had lived there pretty much all his life. He was very committed to the civil rights movement. He was a very straightforward, honest person, and he and Mickey worked very closely. When James Chaney became a full-time CORE worker, he and Mickey started making plans to contact various churches and various groups about participation, primarily in voter registration activities.
This flew in the face of white supremacists. Keeping blacks from voting was key to maintaining white power. The Ku Klux Klan targeted Mickey Schwerner. Sunday, June 21st, 1964. It was just one day after Andrew Goodman had joined up with Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney.
Mickey and James heard that the Mount Zion Church had been burned and several people had been quite badly beaten.
The trio drove to the church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, to assess the damage and provide emotional support to the congregation. But they soon ran into trouble. After the men left the church, they were stopped by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price, who escorted them to the Neshoba County Jail. They were held on a variety of trumped-up charges and were not allowed to make a telephone call. At around 10 p.m., without explanation, Deputy Sheriff Price told them they were free to leave the jail. The three young men didn't drive far before they were once again stopped by Deputy Sheriff Cecil Price. This time, he delivered them into the hands of the Ku Klux Klan. The three men were driven down an old logging road to a remote location where the car stopped. They were ordered out and each shot. But the Klan had miscalculated. The disappearance of the three civil rights workers created an indelible story of black and white brothers fighting for a noble cause. Instead of turning away in fear, America aimed a laser-like focus on the South.
That was part of the whole point of Freedom Summer. They decided that if they brought the sons and daughters of America's white elite down there, the country would pay attention. And boy, were they right, because as soon as this mixed trio disappeared, it became a huge national event.
The day after the workers were reported missing, the FBI, acting on a tip, discovered Mickey Schwerner's 63 Ford Fairlane station wagon in a thicket about 80 feet off the highway. As J. Edgar Hoover updated President Johnson over the phone, the car, which had been torched, was still smoldering.
Apparently what's happened, these men have been killed. Although I can't tell whether anybody's in there in view of the intense heat. Well, now what would make you think they've been killed? Because of the fact that it is the same car that they were in Philadelphia, Mississippi.
As it turned out, that there were no bodies in the car, but the grisly discovery was nonetheless bad news to friends and family.
Cars don't get burned and buried in swamps with the inhabitants of them last known to have been held by Mississippi sheriffs and have a happy ending.
Hoover suggested to Johnson that U.S. Marshals be sent to Mississippi, but the president wanted FBI. You get your men in there now, he ordered. Hoover had no choice but to comply. The FBI director sent 150 FBI agents, despite his own personal animosity toward the movement. Johnson also sent Navy divers to hunt for the three men. Meanwhile, in Washington, the uproar over the 3 missing civil rights workers ignited the political process. Within a week after their disappearance, the national attention it attracted helped convince Congress to get behind Johnson's 1964 Civil Rights Bill. With Southern legislators no longer able to stem the tide of change, the bill was passed and Johnson signed it into law on July 2nd, 1964. As history was being made, Martin Luther King was at his side. With the new law in place, the FBI began infiltrating the Klan with a controversial policy of recruiting a network of paid Klan informants. Hoover felt it was a necessary evil. In early August, the policy paid off. An informant who'd reportedly been paid $30,000 told the FBI where to look. The bodies of Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner were found buried beneath an earthen dam. Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner were perceived as martyrs. The story of their death had a ripple effect in nearly every segment of American society.
They gave their life, they gave some blood to help redeem the very soul of America.
It lit a fire on the college students around America to come on into the South, take the risk, help blacks register to vote, and move America forward in this whole struggle for justice.
But Mississippi was digging in its heels. Despite the fact that FBI agents learned from Klan informants the identities of 18 men believed to be involved in the murders, not one of the suspects was brought up on murder charges. Finally, the U.S. Justice Department stepped in. On October 20th, 1967, 7 Klansmen, including Imperial Wizard Sam Bowers and Deputy Price, were found guilty of federal civil rights violations in the deaths of the 3 men. Their sentences ranged from 3 to 10 years. But was it justice?
I don't think there was justice because civil rights were violated, yes, but 3 men were murdered, and they were not tried for murder.
But the 3 civil rights workers did not die in vain. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the movement had gained incredible momentum. The movement would continue to struggle for voting rights. The war was to be waged in Alabama. Casualties would include a young black activist and a white Christian minister.
And one of them carried this club and swung it and hit Jim on the side of the head here.
White or black, the threat of death was very real.
Now that you've seen Free at Last Part 1, talk about this. Does a successful movement for lasting social change require martyrs? Did the deaths of activists Schwerner, Chaney, Goodman, Evers, and King set back the civil rights movement, propel it forward, or both? Discuss the reasons for your answer. Now try this. Imagine that you have been selected to speak at the dedication of a memorial for one of the leaders of the civil rights movement. Write and deliver that speech to your class. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Free at Last. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests The Civil Rights Movement, A Photographic History by Stephen Kasher. Consider this before viewing Free at Last, Part 2. Jesse Jackson said, "Freedom is more valuable than life." As you watch the program, look for the ways civil rights activists embraced and acted on this principle. Note the forces that drove these people to risk their lives for the civil rights cause. Assignment Discovery now presents Free at Last, Part 2.
As bridges go, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama couldn't appear more unremarkable. Spanning the Alabama River at just over 100 yards, it takes mere seconds to cross by car. And yet, this is a remarkable bridge. For in early 1965, in the midst of the civil rights movement, this bridge spanned two worlds, the world of what was and the world of what could be. Crossing it meant freedom, equality, and even death to some. Jimmy Lee Jackson never even made it to the bridge, but his death at the hands of a state trooper inspired a march that would begin there. Reverend James Reeb crossed the bridge but was turned back and later beaten to death by a white supremacist. Viola Liuzzo also crossed it, but afterwards was murdered by the Klan. This was the cost of freedom.
We always determined that freedom was more valuable than life. The dignity was more important than a comfort zone. And when you're on that frequency, then graveyards cannot contain such an idea.
In January 1965, the focus of the civil rights movement was no longer segregation. The previous campaigns had achieved the goal of making segregation illegal. The new campaign would be a fight for congressionally guaranteed voting rights. The battle would begin in Selma. Blacks had no guarantee for the right to vote in local and state elections. Despite the passage of the 15th Amendment 100 years earlier, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting, there was little chance that Southern blacks could exercise their right to vote if whites didn't want them to. There were too many restrictions, such as poll taxes and difficult civics tests inflicted upon blacks who tried to register.
The right to vote is so fundamental in democracy. So Selma was a campaign about something very fundamental that occurred at a time when the movement had a very high profile.
Jimmy Lee Jackson was a young black activist from Alabama who got involved with the movement to attain voting rights. But his life would be cut short. On February 18th, at a demonstration in Marion, Alabama, Jimmy saw his grandfather being beaten, and he pushed his way into the fray to protect him.
He was shot in the stomach by a state trooper, an Alabama state trooper.
The identity of the trooper who'd shot him was kept secret. No charges were ever filed. Civil rights leaders used Jackson's death as a rallying cry.
And out of that came the decision we need to march to Montgomery and bring our cause, walk 50 miles if necessary, to bring the symbolic body of Jimmy Lee Jackson to the governor's mansion and insist upon the right to vote.
The road to Alabama's capital would begin with a journey out of Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It would not be an easy crossing. As plans for the march were set, Alabama Governor George Wallace, an ardent segregationist, issued an order that the marchers not be allowed to leave Selma. As these events unfolded, Reverend James Reeb, a 38-year-old white Unitarian minister in Washington, D.C., paid careful attention. On March 7th of 1965, Reverend Reeb watched news reports of the march. He was horrified by what he saw. The brutality that ensued came to be known as Bloody Sunday. John Lewis was there.
I can still hear the moans, the groans, and people crying out for help. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. To this day, I don't know how I made it back across that bridge, back through the streets of Selma, back to the little church that we had left from.
Governor Wallace's troopers had beaten the men and women who marched, but they hadn't beaten the movement.
It gave the whole sympathy of the nation to those people who bowed their heads and took the blows.
That really marked the civil rights movement coming of age.
The next day, when Martin Luther King urged ministers throughout America to participate in the Selma campaign, Reverend James Reeb was ready to take a stand. He packed his bags for Selma. On March 9th, Reverend Reeb and 2,000 others prepared for a second attempt at marching from Selma to Montgomery. But in light of the previous violence, federal judge Frank Johnson ordered the march postponed. King did not want to disobey a federal order and complied, partially. The marchers crossed the bridge, where they were again met by troopers. They then kneeled and a prayer was said. The marchers turned back and dispersed. That evening, after meeting with Dr. King, the marchers left Brown Chapel and dispersed for dinner. Clark Olson was a minister at the time. He'd come to Selma and had dinner with Reverend Reeb and another minister, Orloff Miller. They had no idea this would be Reeb's last supper.
Three of us decided to go have dinner in the Walker Cafe. It was a restaurant that catered to blacks, and that day was especially open to civil rights marchers. Leaving the restaurant, we turned to the right because it was a shorter distance back to the church. So we walked down here, this short distance toward the end of the block, and it was just about here that we noticed that 3 white men were coming at us from across the street. And they came up behind us, and one of them carried this club and swung it and hit Jim on the side of the head here, just above the ear. And Jim fell to the ground.
Reeb suffered a massive skull fracture and a blood clot. 2 days later, he died. 3 days after that, on March 15, 1965, President Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress and presented his proposal for a Voting Rights Act. He memorialized Reverend Reeb and stunned much of America when he infused his speech with the sacred rallying cry of the civil rights movement.
Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
I was sitting next to Dr. King when Lyndon Johnson said, "And we shall overcome." And tears came down his face. He cried and said, "We will make it from Selma to Montgomery, and the Voting Rights Act will be passed."
As for justice, there was none. 3 men were picked up and charged with Reeb's murder. But the outcome was a familiar refrain. An all-white jury found them not guilty. Nonetheless, like the deaths of the martyrs before him, Reeb's murder would not be forgotten.
I think it affected people in the South. I think Christian people looked at a minister being beaten to death and thought, this may not be Christian what people are doing against these black people. I think it planted some seeds of fairness.
Viola Liuzzo was a different kind of martyr. She was the only white woman to be murdered while participating in the civil rights movement.
Even as young children, we knew that our mom was different from the other moms that we knew. She was spontaneous, she was playful, she was not regimented into the housewife routine.
Viola Liuzzo was different from many of the mothers in Detroit. For one thing, she was a daughter of the South, growing up in Georgia and Tennessee.
She grew up in the Jim Crow South. She saw discrimination firsthand, and she knew that she was as poor or poorer than many of the people who were discriminated against, but she did not feel that same sting.
Even when she moved to Detroit, Viola never stopped caring about people who were less fortunate. But she got married and became a mother of 5, and that became her passion. Viola admired people who committed themselves to the civil rights movement. When the Selma campaign began, she followed it carefully. On March 7, 1965, she found herself watching the same televised footage that had stirred Reverend James Reeb. When Reeb was killed, Viola Liuzzo cried, and then began to pack for a journey to Selma, Alabama. Her husband Jim was concerned, but did not try to stop her. Viola drove her Oldsmobile some 800 miles from Detroit to Selma to participate in history. After 2 failed attempts by Martin Luther King and the civil rights marchers to walk from Selma to Montgomery, they were finally successful, thanks in large part to the protection they received from President Johnson, who sent in federal troops. On March 25th in Montgomery, after a 3-day march, the demonstrators gathered at the Capitol. Despite the suffering that marred the journey, they were jubilant.
We're on the move now. Yes, sir. The beating and killing of our clergymen and young people will not divert us. We're on the move now. Yes, sir.
At the conclusion of the march, Viola Liuzzo shuttled weary protesters back to Selma. She was accompanied by a young black man named Leroy Moton. But there were Klansmen in Selma. They had been sent to keep the marchers under surveillance and were enraged the march had been successful. As Liuzzo and Moton headed back to Montgomery, a carload of Klansmen spotted the pair at a stoplight.
They were a perfect symbol of everything the South hated the most at that point in time. An outside agitator mixing with black people.
The Klansmen followed Liuzzo's car along Highway 80 for 20 miles. Then on this very same stretch of road, pulled alongside and fired shots. As the car went out of control, it crashed into an embankment. Leroy, who played dead when the Klansmen stopped to check their work, was injured but survived. Viola had been shot in the head and died instantly. Within hours, the Liuzzo family learned the awful truth. The death of Viola Liuzzo, as well as those of Reverend James Reeb and Jimmy Lee Jackson, were not in vain. In response to the deaths and the publicity generated by the Selma to Montgomery March, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act on July 9, 1965. The bill outlawed obstacles to black voting and authorized federal officials to enforce fair voting practices. All over the South, thousands of blacks would register to vote during the following year. Even with the right to vote protected by law, the act of voting remained dangerous. As a civil rights activist helped blacks register, a Klan leader would contrive a desperate scheme to slow the onrushing tide of equality. On a cold, blustery January night, 1966, Vernon Dahmer Sr. and his family were asleep in their home here in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Normally, Vernon and his wife Ellie slept in shifts for fear of an attack by the Ku Klux Klan.
It wasn't safe for both of us to sleep at the same time. We slept like this for years, that somebody would be awake when they come.
But on this particular evening, Vernon and Ellie had dropped their guard. It would prove to be a fatal mistake, for tonight, the Klan was coming. The Dahmers had good reason to fear the Klan. Vernon was president of the local chapter of the NAACP. As a successful businessman and farmer with 200 acres, he was able to fund his own civil rights activities. Congress had recently passed the historic Voting Rights Act, and Vernon felt every black should take full advantage. His motto was, "If you don't vote, you don't count." As a respected and beloved leader of the black community, Vernon took it upon himself to help local blacks register to vote. On January 9, 1966, he went on radio urging people to visit his store. He had received permission from the Justice Department to have local citizens pay their $2 poll taxes at his business. The state's Klan group, the White Knights of Mississippi, kept a close eye on Dahmer's activities. The White Knights, under the leadership of Imperial Wizard Sam Bowers, were blamed by the FBI for at least 10 murders, including the killings of the 3 civil rights workers in 1964. But for the time being, Bowers was a free man.
Bowers was on a first-name basis with law enforcement all over Mississippi, figured that he was totally untouchable. Bowers was an evil man.
Historians and those who knew him say Bowers believed he was on a religious mission. In accordance with his beliefs, Sam Bowers ordered a storm of violence to rain down on Vernon Dahmer's home and business. Only hours after Vernon had announced his voter registration drive, 2 carloads of Klansmen arrived in the dead of night to carry out the plan. They were 8 in all. Ellie Dahmer awoke to the frightening sounds and smoky smell of the attack. Vernon urged Ellie to hurry out a back window with their 10-year-old daughter Betty, who was screaming in terror. As flames spread throughout the house, the Klansmen stopped shooting and drove away. Vernon then escaped out the back just before the Dahmer home became engulfed in flames. The family was rushed to the hospital. Though 10-year-old Betty had been badly burned, she would recover. But Vernon had breathed in too much smoke. 12 hours after the attack, Vernon Dahmer was dead. As the Dahmers were grieving, President Johnson sent a telegram to Ellie, praising her husband for his civil rights activities. Johnson also ordered an immediate FBI investigation.
For almost 60 solid days, January, February, March, we worked around the clock until we identified those individuals who participated in killing Vernon Dahmer.
But Sam Bowers wasn't concerned. 4 of Bowers' henchmen were convicted, 3 of whom received life sentences. But Imperial Wizard Sam Bowers proved more elusive. He was tried 4 times for the Dahmer killing, with each trial ending in a hung jury. However, in 1967, Bowers was compelled to face justice for his involvement in the 1964 murders of Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. Although no state murder charges had ever been filed, it was proven in federal court that Bowers had ordered the execution of the 3 civil rights workers. He was convicted of conspiracy in depriving the 3 men of their civil rights and served 6 years of a 10-year sentence. But to the Dahmer family, this was only a small measure of justice. Torn apart with grief over the loss of a father and a husband, they vowed to never rest until Sam Bowers was brought to justice. The struggle would take 32 years. Back in 1966, a Mississippi jury had convicted 4 men in connection with the arson of the Dahmer farm and the murder of Vernon Dahmer. But to the Dahmer family, this was incomplete justice.
There were those out there, including Sam Bowers, the head of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, who went through 4 mistrials, could not find a jury back in those days who would convict him. He was there walking the streets for all of those years while my father lay dead in his grave for that time.
As the district attorney was considering a move to reopen the Dahmer case, Clarion Ledger investigative reporter Jerry Mitchell was contacted by a witness who said he could provide blockbuster testimony.
He basically told his story about the conversation he'd overheard of Bowers ordering Dahmer's killing back in 1966. And so that pushed it forward, caused it to be brought back into courtroom.
Mitchell also tracked down former Klan terrorist Billy Roy Pitts. During the 1998 trial of Sam Bowers, Pitts testified that Bowers presided over Klan meetings in which the murder was planned. It was not without a touch of irony that on August 21, 1998, the Dahmer family and Billy Roy Pitts, former Klan terrorist, shared a victory. For on that day, Sam Bowers was convicted of the murder of Vernon Dahmer. The imperial wizard of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan finally had to pay for his crime. He was sentenced to life in prison.
We hope today's verdict reflects the fact that we're living in a new South, and more particularly a new Mississippi.
There was just a burden rolled off our backs, right down to the last person, because we've talked about it. Since the trial, all of us have felt a feeling of relief and accomplishment.
It says something about this desire of people in the South to put this period behind us. And what we're going through in America, and especially in the American South, is another type of revolution. It is having a cleansing effect on the very soul of the South. People want closure. They want to close this dark chapter.
The road traveled by the civil rights martyrs is not one for the history books. It is for contemporary society, to ponder, to remember, to nurture. For it is not a destination. It is a continuing journey.
Wherever there's discrimination, wherever there's segregation, wherever people are suffering, wherever there's pain and hurt because of one race, a color, a religion, a status in life, we must do what we can to alleviate it. That is the struggle, but it's not one that lasts for one day or 1 week or 1 month or 1 year. It's a struggle of a lifetime to create the beloved community, to create one America, one family, one house, the American house, the American family.
Oh, freedom over me, and before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave, and go home to my Lord and be free.
Keep watching. Discussion topics, an activity, and resources for Free at Last are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen Free at Last Part 2, talk about this. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President Lyndon Johnson used the words, "We shall overcome." Do you think they were successful? To what extent do you think racial equality has been achieved in the United States? In what ways does the struggle continue today? Now try this. Imagine you are running for political office. Write your civil rights platform and describe your plan to implement it. Then create a slogan that clearly conveys your beliefs to potential voters. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Free at Last. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests Free at Last by Sarah Bullard.
The preceding program is part of Cable in the Classroom, a free service of the cable communications industry and your local cable company.